information, and we're very fortunate to have Margie with us today. So I will hand it over to you, Margie.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everybody. As Julie said, I'm very happy to be here and helping you understand the value of the organizational profile that's part of the performance excellence criteria. One would think that when you're starting through this process, that the components that are listed within the organizational profile are self-explanatory. It seems when you start reading some of the questions, it seems like that should be not difficult at all. But I can tell you, as a person who has written two of them, one for my current organization, Portico Benefit Services, and prior to this, for an acute care setting within the Fairview system, it's amazing how many questions come up once you start reading through the details. So we thought it would be really important to have these webinars as you start down this journey, because the clarity that's required for understanding the language of performance excellence and translating that into how you talk and how you think is really important. And we want to give you the best chance possible. So why the organizational profile? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when I was writing one the first time, I didn't realize how many questions I couldn't answer. And then you would ask our CFO, and that person could answer some, but not all, our CEO, and you go down the line through different parts of the organization, and you can find out that people have bits and pieces of this information, but it's not encapsulated in one succinct area. And if key parts of the information for the organization are captured by certain people, but not by the whole, it's real hard to align yourself totally. And that was a huge learning for us. We also identified gaps that we just never asked that question before of our organization. So when you look at the organizational profile, it will help you identify gaps. It will help you understand what's important foundationally in order to move forward and do the very best that we can to serve those people that come to our organizations and those that we choose to serve. It can be used as an initial self-assessment. So for the very first time, it could bring out those questions, and it sets the context. When you think about performance excellence, many people have seen the model, which I'll pull up in a moment, and you're thinking about those different process pieces: leadership, strategic planning, workforce, etc. That's where the meat really is. But that means nothing unless this context of the organizational profile is well understood by all. In fact, there are people who have gone through this process. This is some quotes from Lisa Mueller with the Jenks Public Schools, who won the national award in 2005, says that it encourages valuable conversation about the organization's identity. So I had to pull our leaders together to ask the same question that the criteria asked in the profile. And it started, well, for core competencies, it started a 2-day retreat where we went through a facilitated process in order to really understand what it is that made our organization different and unique. We'll talk about that later as we move forward. So it also sets the stage for your strategic situation and your strategic direction. Most organizations do a strategic plan, but are we thinking about the strategic plan in the same way? Probably not. There are so many different varieties and different methodologies that can be used to move an organization forward. But one of the grounding principles would be, for instance, your key challenges and your key advantages, because that takes you more forward. And so this asks those questions prior to any process, any planning. It just says identify the situation. It causes you to look at your organization today and in the future, hence the snapshot. And for Lisa, just as it was for me, it introduces a brand new idea. Core competencies was not a language that any of the organization I worked in used. And yet it was a key component that really helped us form and change some of our organization. This is a quote from John Timmerman, who works with the Gallup organization. I encourage organizations to complete the Baldrige Profile Assessment because it gives them the context to assess the appropriateness of best practices for the business model. So if you don't have alignment and if you don't have good agreement on these particular pieces in that context, it would be very difficult to get the organization to move forward in a succinct way. So with that, the model for the framework, as you can see, rests upon a solid foundation that we call the organizational profile. That's what we're going to talk about today. But the model itself contains all of these different pieces. It says we should have strong processes in our leadership, our strategy. We should know our customers very well. And those particular components will drive the organization to develop strong operational processes, to be able to hire a competent and capable workforce with the right resource amounts that will allow those operations to work well together, all connected to measurement, analysis, and knowledge management so that the different pieces can work together and integrate together. And if that happens well, we should be able to see the results that we're expecting so that we can provide excellence to those we serve. I was asked once years ago to identify which one of these pieces on this model could I live without. The entire audience was asked that question. And the truth is we can't live without any of these pieces. They work in harmony with each other. They work clearly with each other, and they work in an integrated fashion. So today, what we're going to do is look at the organizational profile, and we're going to walk through every piece. If you have that organizational profile template, which I've copied the first page here on this slide, in front of you, you will be able to see that we're going right through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that those particular components are well understood, so that you can move forward. So we're looking for clarity. If you don't have it in front of you, I've copied it into this presentation, so you'll see those referenced very clearly. I then want to give you the context of where and why those questions are important to answer before you even begin considering what are those sustainable processes that fit into those 6 process categories, starting with leadership and strategy. So I will show that alignment. From there, we'll look at an example. We're fortunate it's just been in the past few weeks that our very first National Baldrige Award recipient, who is now a role model for the United States in long-term care, has just come out. They were just awarded in 2016, and their organizational profile and their organizational summary has just been loaded on the NIST site. So we're going to use that today. And as Julie pointed out, your questions are going to be really important, because the primary purpose for this webinar today, and the one that's happening again on August 8th, is to provide clarity and to translate some of these Baldrige type questions into the language that is familiar within the long-term care business sector. So she mentioned that there's a chat box, and if you've not used a webinar before, you should have a vertical banner on your screen that has a lot of detail on it, but towards the bottom, and mine is resting on the right side of my screen, you're going to see a box that says type message here. And I just really encourage you to use it. In fact, it's going to be better if this particular webinar has some interactive pieces, and this is the only way we can interact. And I encourage you to write those questions, to type those questions in as they come. I have set aside, and you'll see my slides, stops in the presentation today where the slide will say your questions. And whatever you've come up with up to that point, hopefully there's some clarifying questions you have, and Julie will proceed to read through them and offer them as an interactive part of this conversation I want to have with us today. So the only other thing I want to mention before we move on is you may have already seen this, may have a copy of it, but the Baldrige Excellence Framework, the lower picture on your right-hand side of your screen, is a booklet that not only has the organizational profile, but has all the pieces of each part of the criteria, the 6 process pieces and guidelines for results. You can find that at NIST.gov and download a copy of it for your organization. So Kindred, as I mentioned before, is the organization that we're going to be working with. You should have a copy of their full application. And again, we're going to be focusing on just the organizational profile. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best organization in the world. None of our organizations that achieve even the National Baldrige Award are considered flawless. There's no such thing as perfection. It's always a journey. In fact, the opportunities for improvement for this organization are many. It just means that they have approached it in a way that they have seen excellence in results by utilizing the criteria and have achieved a certain amount of maturity and proficiency with this particular type of model, and they're willing to share their best practices because there might be some things that they are doing that might be of help to other organizations around the United States. If you went to the Performance Excellence conference this past year, we did have someone from Kindred, the Mountain Valley, just that one organization from Mountain Valley show. I think it was the CEO. She was there, and she provided us with some insight into how they've approached using this as a way to improve their organization, and also some of the best practices that gave them the recognition. Well, Julie did some research on who signed up for this webinar today, and I'm really glad to see that we have a good variety of people who are representing different parts of our part of the healthcare continuum. And the interesting thing about this is this organizational profile and the criteria is scalable, meaning you can be a very small set-alone organization or a multi-site organization. You can be a skilled nursing facility, you can be adult day, home care, housing with services, assisted living. It doesn't matter. It fits for everyone. In fact, it was interesting to me, I learned once that a 4th grade classroom teacher used the criteria just for their classroom, not even the whole school, let alone the school district. But consider when you're listening to these questions, your size and what your scope is. If you're a multi-site organization, you would write to the fact that you have this number of buildings with these types of services. And then the expectation would be that you have systematic approaches that flow through the entire organization at large. If you're a standalone organization today and you're thinking about yourself in that way, but belong to a larger organization, that too should work. And feel free to reference that as you move forward. You don't work without your parent organization. In fact, our example is just Mountain View, but they belong to a very large multi-site organization called Kindred. The only place they're talking about is their place, but they receive many different processes and many different pieces that help their organization work from their parent company. So with that, we'll get started. We're going to walk through a few pieces, and as we do this again, just remind you to pop in some of your questions under the chat feature. And this is probably the most fundamental demographic piece of the entire profile. It simply says, let's start by identifying who you are. What is your environment? Let's take a look at what your location is. What does your community look like? How long have you been in the community? What's your beginnings? Do you have a history? Were you something else and then turned into another type of culture because you saw the needs of the community changing. What is your scope? Again, are you a multi-site? Are you standalone? Are you looking at yourself as a standalone amongst a larger organization? And really, basically what it is anything that you see that would be important to help the reader get a clear picture of who you are. And when I say the reader, that could be anyone from within your organization to external, if you're, for instance, applying for the merit recognition. We have used this organizational profile in my organization in the recruitment and the hiring process and the onboarding process, because once you have all of this written, it's a real good way for you to be able to give a clear picture to someone brand new coming in who's going to work for you. It's all there in one place, and they would be the reader. They're going to be part of the organization, but this is one way to give them a good, solid foundation of who you are. And then, of course, your service offerings. Who are the type of individuals that you serve? What made you choose that particular service offering? And again, the examples here are you part of the skilled community, subacute, both, assisted living, etc. So you're going to see a slide that looks like this with the left-hand banner periodically throughout this webinar, because those are the 6 process categories plus results. What I've done here is highlighted in yellow a few examples of why writing those particular pieces down in your organizational profile are going to support you and align and provide context as you consider the processes. So in this case, for example, we have leadership. Under the leadership category, it asks senior leaders to try to understand what your responsibilities are to your society. How do you support your community? And in the profile, as you saw before, it asks you to identify who your communities are or what your community is and what's the flavor of it, so that when it comes time to identifying how you support that community, it makes sense. Sometimes when people are writing about their demographic location and some of their community support needs, you fall into the strategy category. As you're going to see from our example, one of the pieces that Mountain View chose to write about was the fact that in their community, it's very difficult for them to recruit and retain qualified staff. And that's a feature of the fact of where they're located in that part of the country. So it might point out some advantages and challenges under strategy. Again, that would also be the example I showed you about recruit and retain in the workforce. And then, of course, your metrics. So what is it about that community? How do you contribute? How much do you contribute? How do you know that some of the things that you're doing for the community at large are making a difference? Those are the things and the questions you will be addressing as you move through the rest of the criteria. But it's all going to circle back and refer back to how you wrote who you are in the first place. This I don't expect you to be able to read, and thankfully Julie sent you a copy of the entire description that our example from Kindred wrote. But I just wanted to point out that they talk at length about what the community is like and what the industries in the communities are. We talk about mining in the city. That has nothing to do with the fact that they're providing healthcare in the community, but it talks a little bit about from where their customers, their residents, their patients, their clients hail. If you look at the third paragraph down, it says, although the setting is beautiful, it masks some of the very real challenges that make long-term care among the most difficult on the spectrum of healthcare services, the shortage of qualified workers. So again, they chose to give you a real clear flavor of that organizational environment. If you look over to the right, you can see the healthcare service offerings. And in this case, they've segmented their service offerings into short-term care rehab, we might call it transitional care in Minnesota, and long-term care. And then it talks about the size of that part of their portfolio, 22%, 78%. So again, it provides that context moving forward. We're going to move on now to questions 3 and 4, which again are very foundational. It's your mission, your vision, values, and core competencies. So question 3 not only talks about what are they, but it asks, what are the methods you use to communicate your mission, vision, and values across your organization? This may be a very natural and solid, long-term existing part of your organization to have these 3 components many people call a core belief, but for some, it may be the first time you're thinking about it. And if you have any questions about how, for instance, to design a mission statement, I know that Julie has collected some good resources for you if you're going to engage in that process. If you already have these, just state them in your org profile, because your mission is a statement of the reason for your existence. The vision goes beyond that. It says, what is your dream? Who do you want to be in the future? Or what is it that you're striving to become? So the way it's written is a little bit different. Your mission could say, we're here to provide services for the aging population, but the vision might be that you want to be the best in this community, especially as it relates to short-term rehab, for example. And that vision statement would then need to be thought through clearly, because if you want to be the best, how do you know you're the best? So that's one of the frameworks or one of the lenses that any organization goes through as they select those adjectives to describe their vision. The best in our community, the best in our state, the best in our country, and then what measurements would we use to understand what that is? It's just an example. And then values. Typically, these are one-word statements that are your beliefs, your attitudes that guide your behavior, relationships with others. In my organization right now, we have 5 values. We have respect, we've got collaboration, excellence, service, stewardship. And those are the things that we live by. Those are the pieces that we hope all of our employees emulate. As you can see, that might not be the same set of values for every organization. We went through a really strong discernment process because we were wondering if innovation should be part of our values. For instance, if you went to 3M, you'd see that they clearly have innovation as one of their core values. And we decided that just wasn't who we were at the time, that we were more about customer service, and we were more about learning from best practices of others rather than pioneering innovations. But again, this is key and unique to your particular facility or your multi-site organization. The final piece that's asked for here was new for me and maybe new for others. It's written on this page as core competencies. When we first asked this question, and I'm just going to tell you my story, and this was only a few years ago, we asked everyone to write down what we thought in a retreat, what our core competencies were. This is of our leadership group. And there was a little bit of confusion at the time between what competencies do we need our staff to have? What qualifications do they have? Excellence in nursing care, we need them to be certified in this and certified in that, and competent in this and competent in that, versus what are the organization's competencies? And it's the latter that we're looking for here. It's not at the individual level. We're looking for statements of what the organization does best. So it's your areas of greatest expertise, those areas that are strategically important capabilities that are central to fulfilling your mission. Again, you'd want to lay them side by side. This is where we got into long discussions. It provides you competitive advantage and differentiates you in the marketplace. So when we asked ourselves the question, we have excellent customer service, for example. We had to ask ourselves, does that differentiate ourselves in the marketplace? Do we do that better than our nearest competitor? Would our competitors be able to do it in the same way, as good as we do? And that gave us pause. And it gives a lot of organizations pause, because every organization might say they want to care for people, or they might want to have good customer service. But what part of that makes a difference? I was in an organization recently who said that they paid attention to their very unique and specific cultural artifacts of the community. And we know the community the best because we've been here a long time. We have a deep history, and we hired strictly from this community. So we know our customers better than, for instance, a newer organization who may not have that advantage. So those are some of the questions you'd want to ask in identifying what your core competencies are. Well, how do you use these mission, vision, and values and core competencies? Leadership has to be deeply engaged, not only in affirming what the mission, vision, and values are, but understanding not only what the process was to design it. Was it top down? Was it grassroots up? Was it designed originally 100 years ago? Do you ever revisit it? How do senior leaders participate in that mission, vision, and values? How do they deploy and share the information with the entire staff so that they can be part of the process? And again, we're not asking for these pieces yet, but it is aligned right clearly to leadership and strategy and how you achieve it. So how does the workforce engage? A lot of people talk recently about, does your mission, vision, and values, can people repeat it? Does every person in the organization have an opportunity to be asked or know what they've bought into when they go into this organization? Can they repeat what the mission statement is? That's why many people are taking their 2 or 3 sentence mission statement and turning it into something short, pithy, and repeatable. Sometimes they call it the elevator speech. And something that engages folks. Are the words that you're using, and is leadership paying attention to the words that people use so that they know that when I decide to come to work here, that I can buy into that, I want to be a part of it. And because of that, I know that I can serve those that are part of our organization even better. One thing about the core competencies that's illustrated in the supply chain comment I have at the end, which deals with operations, is another important factor with core competencies. If you determine that one of the things you do is best, and it is one of your core competencies, you would want to do a double check and be sure that you're not outsourcing a piece of that competency. That's what you'd want to keep for yourself. So if you had a core competency, for example, that you had superior dining services, you would not want to be outsourcing your dining services to another company. You might want to market that you have superior dining services because you have partnered with XYZ chef from whatever restaurant you have to bring in certain meals or recipes, but that wouldn't be your organization's core competency. So understanding how your supply chain works makes a big difference. You may have Hoyers and other large equipment in your organization. You don't build them yourself because that's not your core competency, but you want to make sure that you've got materials and supplies, etc., that you're using for third-party vendors available at the point of need and at the point of care. Okay, here's the example that Mountain Valley put out. And many people do have a visual representation of their mission, vision, and values. They chose to put their core competencies in here. And if you have something like this, just plop it right in, because it's simply a way for the grounding and the foundation to stay intact. If I was in conversation with Mountain Valley right now, I would ask those questions about their core competencies. Highly engaged workforce. So what is it about your workforce that makes them more highly engaged than your nearest competitors? If you have a patient-centered care focus, do you do that differently than others? Is that what sets you apart? And those are the questions I would ask. And then it would then come down to some of the results that you might want to check into. Okay, here's our first point where we're going to stop for a moment and ask for questions. Have any come in?
I have not seen any questions in the chat box yet.
Okay. A lot of these pieces are pretty standard, self-explanatory. Again, we did split this webinar into 2 pieces because we felt that if you listen to the first half for a while, and then you go back to your working environment and you start pondering, you may start developing questions, or you may start designing some action plans that say, we're going to have to get the group together and really address this question or that question that's in the organizational profile. So when you come back on August 8th, you may have some questions about some of these pieces that you didn't consider today.
Margie, I have a question for you. The question around methods used to communicate your mission, vision, and values across your organization can be very challenging. In the different organizations that you've worked with, have you seen some effective strategies that have really stood out to you?
Yes. People are trying to get creative all over the place. I mean, you can have pure, simple email deployment and forums, live forums, etc. But more recently, I've been seeing people try to keep the mission, vision, and values alive and in front of you, in front of people more consistently. If you have conference rooms, you might have plaques where the mission, vision, values are well displayed. In fact, in our conference rooms right now, we have that. But we also have this interesting bucket on each of our conference room tables, whereby if you discuss or you say, it's really important for us to respect each other when we're dealing in an interdisciplinary team, and we know that respect is one of our values, someone will then take a marble from the table and plop it into this jar, and we're trying to collect as many marbles in our jar as possible so that we can make our values and our mission vision come alive. So how often does it come up? Some people have agendas, meeting agendas, and they have, as a start of each meeting, something called a mission moment, whereby a story might be shared that has a direct relationship to either serving our customers well through our mission vision, or we have an example where our values were honored between staff members. So again, look at where your artifacts are in your organization. Do you attend meetings? Do you have drinking cups for everybody and putting the words right on your drinking cups that you give out as employee giveaways? And that is more than just putting something on a wall. It has to be followed up with senior leaders and the rest of the organization asking for the dialogue to happen, all the way down to department meetings, shift change meetings, to large company-wide or organization-wide forums. Does that help?
Yeah, those are great ideas. Thank you, Margie.
Okay, let's move on. The workforce profile. Identify your key workforce groups or segments: nursing, dietary, housekeeping, administration, etc. That sounds very normal, very average. You would put your work groups down. The desired FTEs, as Julie has offered a grid here as a way to organize your thinking. Again, if you've got openings, we're not talking about that. It's more, what is the percentage of people in your organization that are part of that work group? So it's your desired FTEs. Maybe they've got professional requirements. But what really is probably one of the key features that makes this profile of your workforce different than simply stating your demographics is the final column that's on this page. It's called key engagement drivers. And my organization is still working on this, because we can tell you how many people work in different departments, but then the question becomes, why am I segmenting the workforce by department? Is our nursing department engaged in their work because of different drivers than the nutrition services department, for example? Is that the right way to segment? Some people list their departments, but then they say we segment by years of service, or maybe they segment by age of the employee. So a lot of people think that millennials come to work and have a different set of engagement drivers than people who are in the boomer category. They want different things. They need different things. They engage with the organization because of different features. And so when we ask for this to be created, you can probably start with a departmental segmentation process, but then go a little deeper, go a little further. Draw a hard line horizontally across this grid and say, but our engagement drivers differ in this way. And think about it in those terms. The other piece of the engagement drivers is, how do you know? I, for example, and most of the senior leadership that I work with right now are not in the millennial category. And we can guess for what their key drivers are. We could say, I observed this or I observed that. But have I gone through a process, or has our organization gone through a process where we ask, do we have survey tools? Have we ever thought of focus groups? Have we identified what these are? And we haven't. And so we're still trying to hone down and come to what those key engagement drivers are. And you want to know what they are, because that will drive some of your actions internally to develop that workforce and to retain that workforce. So this may seem like a pure, easy task to just drop some information in here, but I would ask all of us to think a little bit more deeply about that key engagement driver category. Because if you knew that, you could start answering questions in these particular categories from the criteria. How do senior leaders engage the entire workforce? Well, if I knew that texting, it's a crazy example, but texting was one of the best ways that a senior leader could make sure that people attend a key forum or a key work meeting, I would use it. And so that means I would know my workforce, I would know their preferences, and I would be engaging. And I would be taking personal responsibility for using those key engagement drivers to guide some of my actions, because it starts at the top, it starts in the middle, it starts at the end. It's a whole organization working together. And the criteria say that we can be stronger if our leadership takes an active role with our workforce. So again, segmentation is critical. And you would probably illustrate that not only in your organizational profile, but you'd talk about it in your workforce category 5, because you're going to be listening to your workforce to determine their level of engagement based on those drivers, their levels of satisfaction, and then what are the processes you use to continue to strengthen and deepen that workforce engagement. Results, I think, is where it really pops up the best and is most clear. If you, for instance, this is where it gets really practical. If you have an annual workforce satisfaction survey tool or instrument, are you able to slice and dice the data by those segments that you illustrated in your org profile? Can you cut it by department if that's the best? Can you cut it by age if this whole millennial boomer thing pays off for you? What about male versus female? What about years of service? 2 years or under, 20 years or more? And it all depends on if you're looking for different features that help engage that particular part of the workforce. So when you're writing your organizational profile, keep in mind that as you're writing down your categories or your segments, can I learn from those segments based on any of the measurement tools that I have? So here is our Mountain Valley example again. And you can see that they have illustrated by gender, by position type, by tenure, education, employment status, ethnicity. And then they have the drivers. And what they have illustrated here is, and you can see that paragraph in the middle, changes in our workforce needs are the result of different expectations among the younger generation of employees who don't want to work extra hours or pick up an open shift. I would expect that in those figures that are mentioned here, this is where you would go and find their results. You would find their metrics of their survey tools, where questions like this were answered, and answered by different ages or by different genders, and whatever made sense to them. So they took their drivers of workforce engagement and married it with their satisfaction survey tool and wrote down the exact question. People in my team are protected from health and safety hazards. I have a clear idea of what is expected of me. So one way you may want to finish your organizational profile might be like this organization did, which is unearth that survey tool, read the questions, read your results over time, and see what matters to different people for different reasons. And then use that as your way to answer and respond to that question in the organizational profile. Okay, any questions about this?
Just a reminder, if you have any questions, make sure you type it in the chat box. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Okay, I can see that there are about 30 people on this call. So it's a great number of people who are interested in starting this process. Let's move forward. We're going to cover questions 6, 7, and 8 in this next section, which is what are your assets, your regulations, and your structure. Julie did a pre-assessment not long ago where the word assets was scored low, meaning there must be questions out there on what do you mean by organizational assets? And that is just clearly what are your brick and mortar buildings? What are your age and square footage? Do you have any large equipment? She's written some examples here. Your electronic medical record, alarm devices, transfer equipment, etc. And it just asks to identify what you have and what belongs to you. Your regulatory environment, feel free to use that as a list. Most everyone on the call, depending on the granular sector that you belong in, are more than familiar with what your regulatory environment is. You can list the different agencies and organizations who have and ask you to participate in those standards. And then the structure. If you could include your organizational chart with your organizational profile, it shows one way where decisions are made and communication happens, but sometimes your organizational chart doesn't always include how your board structure fits in with that. So you may, and your parent company, for example. So consider that when you're filling out the organizational profile, to take it all the way up through how decisions are made, all the way up through your board, even community boards. Why is that important? Well, regulatory senior leaders need to assure legal and ethical behavior happens at all times. Sometimes your challenges that you illustrate in your strategy have to do with meeting your regulatory environmental needs. And you'd want to be able to illustrate that and be able to account for it and use it within your strategy. The organizational profile impacts your workforce every day. It determines who reports to who. It could assume how decisions are made. It is clearly known, and the Gallup organization says that one of the key drivers for engagement that keep people retained within an organization is their relationship with their primary supervisor. So it just, again, is another illustrative piece that helps the reader understand how work happens, how work gets done, and how decisions are made. And you would probably want to include some of your measures of regulatory compliance right in your results. In fact, a lot of the categories that are inherent within the performance excellence framework are, for instance, your clinical results, which are already being asked for by regulatory agencies. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can use things that you are already doing to be sure that things are working appropriately and positively. If you neglect a regulatory piece and don't share that within your profile, that would be a huge gap, because it's an important part of what you're doing. And it's kind of your foundation that says, if we've got this, then how do we continue to move forward to serve those we serve with excellence and with innovation, as long as we have our basic bare minimum requirements covered within our regulations. Okay, so no surprise, Mountain Valley has their state facility standards, OSHA, CMS, HIPAA, workforce security, facility licensure, their district with infection control. They've talked a little bit about their size in the early parts of this example, how many semi-private rooms they have, quad rooms, etc., what their square footage is, a little bit about their large pieces of equipment, how they operate, what they have. And then on the right side, it does talk about their structure, from all the way from where the workforce and the work actually happens, through their board of directors and their parent organization. So let's talk about customers and stakeholders. We have about 10 minutes left before our time is up. And we finally hit probably the most important piece of the first part of the organizational profile. You would want to illustrate who your customers and stakeholders are, what their requirements are, and how you learned of those requirements. So I spent some time earlier talking about the workforce and how the workforce itself has drivers of engagement, and this is pretty much the same. So if you say that you have residents in your care communities, what is it that the residents want from you? What are the things that are most important to them? And then write those down. And then how did you learn of those? I really love, Julie, how you put this table together, because again, I can remember many of us saying we knew exactly what our customers wanted, and then we wrote them down, but then when we actually went and asked, we didn't realize how nuanced it was. So again, think about your segmentation in this methodology as well. You're going to see in the example that family was considered another segment of the key customer groups. So residents, families, maybe patients are different from residents, depending on the fact that they're a short-term stay. I think of a time many years ago, and this is an acute care example, but my son went into the hospital. He was getting a tonsillectomy, 2 years old. He was the patient, and I was the family member. And if you would have asked me, what do I need, what do I require from the hospital for this procedure, and you asked my son what he required, you would get two very different answers. My son said, I want to know that my button to call the nurse is right there. He loved that little button. And he knew that if he pressed it, he could get someone to come. And that was so important to him. I, on the other hand, wanted great outcomes, and I wanted him to be in no pain. But my son was not able to articulate that. And so he had a whole different priority. And the question we need to ask ourselves are, do we have nuances within our customer groups? Is it important to separate families from residents? Is it important to separate residents from patients, depending on types of services they're getting? And then what about other stakeholders, your community at large? There may be other pieces that you'd want to identify. But again, if you list these stakeholder groups, that means they're that important enough to you that you would be able to understand what their requirements are, and you're committed to learning how those requirements evolve and change over time. So you've got an ongoing methodology to create a two-way dialogue or survey tools or whatever else you might have. Clearly, customers and stakeholders align to category 3, the customer category, where it starts with voice of the customer. How do you listen? And so if the word customer is your generic term, you would translate that into your customer segments. How do you talk about them? Are they your patients, your residents, your family members, or is it just those we serve in one fell swoop and they're all the same? What are their requirements? Do family members want access? And is access, maybe the resident or the patient wants access to their family members just as much as the family wants to come in at any time and be in a safe environment. I don't know, that's up to you. That's up to you to understand and determine. So segmentation is truly the key, and that plays out all the way through measurement, all the way through results, because then as you're looking and using your satisfaction survey tool, you'd want to ask, am I able to slice and dice that data down to the level that I need based on the different drivers, different requirements that each of the customer groups has? It also begs the question, if I'm listing community as a key customer group, or if I'm listing family members as a key customer group, am I surveying them or am I asking them similar questions on a regular and ongoing basis? So in this case, our key market segments, for our example, are long-term care and short-term rehab. Okay, so I'm thinking now that I'm going to be seeing through the entire application, through all of the processes, are we looking at long-term care residents differently than short-term rehab patients, if those are the terms that I use? That would be really important. So I get down to the requirements and I'm reading, so residents or patients reflective of short-term rehab care have the same requirements. Aha. So they have found out that regardless of the fact that they are identifying two different business types, long-term and short-term, the requirements for people that are served in those arenas are the same. Everybody wants quality of care, free from pain. Everybody wants to make choices. Everyone wants a safe environment. They want adequate staffing levels, trained staff communication. And they have followed that up with the measurement so that we can see how they're meeting those requirements. But they have separated families. So again, in this case, they see their families as having different needs. Some of them might be similar, like keep a safe, clean environment, and perhaps choices, but there's some subtle differences. And they felt that it was important to understand what those differences were so that when they design action plans and intervention strategies to improve some of those areas, they can follow that back up with seeing whether or not their customer groups agree. Okay, any questions on this area?
I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay. Well, fortunately for all of us, we have 3 minutes left. So I'm going to end with suppliers today. And again, these are suppliers. Remember your core competencies. these are the areas that you've outsourced. And you wouldn't want to outsource things that you consider your core competencies, but you again would want to list them. Who are your suppliers of goods and services? What are your mechanisms for communicating with them? How do they interact with you with other parts of your work? Are they included within your strategic planning, for example? How do you know that they're doing well? Do you have service level agreements? So what are the limitations, special business relationships, or special requirements? So you would understand that perhaps and align that with your strategy. How do you decide what should be outsourced? That's a leadership thing as well. How are your suppliers aligned in operations within the supply chain? Is it seamless? Are they held accountable? And then how do you know they're operating up to the standards that you want? We have, in my organization, we have a vendor supplier that does some of our record keeping, and they have a standard that says we want satisfaction up to 80% in satisfied and very satisfied, or top 2 box. And we said, that's great for you, but we are expecting top box, or just the very satisfied standard. So we're working hard with our vendors to increase the expectation and raise the bar for those they serve within our organization. So again, in our example, they used a grid methodology. They've listed their key suppliers, and they've also included partners, physician partners, collaborators as hospitals. They've identified their support role, their communication method, and in their case, innovation was an important feature that they wanted to also illustrate within their organizational profile. Any questions on this category?
Not that I see.
Well, we've made it through probably the first half. I think the second time we get together, which will be August 8th, the list is even shorter. So we might even end a little earlier. But we did want to split it again because after you've gone through this, you might be in the process right now of completing that template that Julie sent, or writing your org profile. I thought I could sit down and write it all by myself, and I realized after identifying these pieces that it wasn't the writing that was important as some kind of paper compliance. It was the dialogue and conversation that these questions offered if I brought them up in a forum with my other senior leaders, because it's in the process of answering the questions that really helps an organization coalesce. So I hope that offered you some points of clarity. That was our goal for today. And judging from no questions, maybe I did a good job, but we'll find out. Log and list your questions between now and August 8th. And Julie, I'll let you sign us off, but we'll see you again on August 8th.
Great. Thank you so much, Marjorie. We really look forward to our next session on the 8th. And we know that a lot of your questions will come up as you dig into this further and you start working on your own organizational profile. So just know that we're here as a resource for you. So we recorded the session and we'll have it available, so you'll also have that as a resource to go back and revisit some of these areas as you're working on your profile. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.